Hello, all. CK here, and welcome back to her ongoing Candor, where I, your favorite blue collar muse, talks about her spiritual work and doesn't care if anybody believes her or not. This today, this today, I'm meeting you the day after Ash Wednesday. And as many of you know, many of you who are familiar with my spiritual work knows that as an abyssal, during Lent, I am literally in the abyss. Because when I get the interment of ashes, God's glory departs from me so I can work with my abyssal team. And one of the things that I'm doing, the main thing that I'm doing, is removing my protection because I've just moved on. I have grown tired and I'm drawing a line in the sand, and I'm going to use those scissors that I talk about in the path to unpunishable. And this episode is called Shield to Joyous because that's my new commission. And as part of that, I'm going to be spending some time talking about post-evangelism and how it aligns with the way I live and how it aligns with the way I create, and why my faith and my life can no longer exist inside the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, because they are on the other side of a very important line. So much so that I am confident in declaring it dead as a denomination. So when we first started her ongoing Candor, before it was named that, I had talked about the spread I did with Salty Witch and how I was talking about how I won. But I've never really got into that. But now that we're in the season of Lent, I want to talk about these decisions I've made a little bit more and what comes next. Now, like I mentioned, the major change is that I've completely cut ties with the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA, and have transitioned my religious identity to post-evangelism. And I know a lot of people will sit up there and start rolling their eyes because when you think of that, you think about deconstruction. And it's often misunderstood, right? A lot of people think it's a loss of faith or a reactionary rejection of Christianity and Christian values. Yeah. I've even heard it described, along with deconstruction more broadly, that it's an excuse to sin, which is really fucking rich, given how often punishment is used to encourage people to turn a blind eye. But we're going to have the conversation later. For me, post-evangelism and deconstruction are not an abandonment of belief. It is a position, right? And for me, it says that I refuse to outsource my Christian conscience to an institution like the PCA that cannot tolerate accountability or personal responsibility. I am absolutely done with that. Deconstruction begins where the cost of belonging becomes silence in the face of harm, and where obedience is valued. Obedience of falling in line is valued more than truth, safety, or repair, right? At its core, deconstruction and post-evangelicalism prioritize ethics over someone's authority. And it asks whether a belief system reduces harm or merely explains it away, sweeps it under the rug, pretend that they don't see it. It rejects fear and punishment as primary moral tools. And it rejects the idea that cruelty is necessary to preserve, quote unquote, church order, right? And going back to the fear and punishment is as primary moral tools, one of the biggest things in the post-evangelical movement is the rejection of a constant, conscious, eternal torment in hell. Now, I am facing the same way in terms of people using the fear of hell to control people. I vary slightly because conscious, eternal torment does exist if you choose it. If you continue to choose poorly and grieve the Holy Spirit, if you continue to choose cruelty because you're in an environment that lets you be cruel without consequence, or you strive to be cruel without consequence, not taking any responsibility. And a lot of times, people, and I know you know folks like that because I know folks like that, who stay in situations that they know is bad for them. They know is poisonous to them. They know is toxic for them and their families and people they love. But they stay in because they're afraid of how it will appear, their reputation, or their loss of status. So they stay in this toxic situation that is literally hurting them, right? And then they want to say that they're the victim. That's what hell is, but without God's protection. Because right now, a lot of people don't realize that it could be a lot worse if it wasn't for the protection that God provides, if it wasn't for the grace that God provides. And also, in this framework, joy, going back to the title, is not a reward for compliance. You don't get joy because, well, they realize that they don't get joy when they comply. They're promised it, but they never truly receive it. So they feel they have to do more or they haven't done enough. And it's a whole cycle. But in the deconstruction and post-evangelical, I have a hard time pronouncing that word. So I'm going to say PE, like physical ed for now, until I can wrap my tongue around it. But in deconstructionism and in PE, joy is, it's how you, and specifically your nervous system, knows that your choices and your path are aligned, and truthful to God's will. And this framework, it doesn't require perfection. Half the time, it doesn't even require certainties, because that's where faith comes in. And rejects domination, control, or it doesn't require fear to function. It doesn't require any of these to work. It allows belief to be measured by how people are treated, if they're taken care of, like we are commissioned in the Bible, rather than how fiercely doctrine is defended. And that's one of the biggest things that I found, especially in PCA. I remember there was a Christian publication that was extending health insurance to same-sex couples and couples who weren't married. And instead of appreciating that this company wanted to take care of their own and make sure that they were healthy, I literally saw people I adored complain about that. Because it is never about, the children. It's never about taking care of your neighbor. It's about, there has to be a line that makes us superior to others. And that's so antithetical to what I believe. And I'm tired of pretending that it doesn't exist. Because actual Christianity, especially through the PE lens, insists that faith be lived in ways that protect the vulnerable, that promotes the best for all around you, right? It names harm. and it names damage plainly and accepts responsibility for our actions without humiliation or spectacle. Now, I know that for some of y'all out there, even saying this out loud feels like a spectacle, and that doing things like naming harm is often framed as intention seeking. But in places where the truth is not welcome, and I found this to be the case in the PCA, that framing is saying that you are, by naming harm and seeing it plainly, that framing is part of how silence is maintained. Post-evangelism, evangelicalism gave me language and community for something that my body and my work has already taught me. That any system that requires silence when you are harmed, it requires any system that requires silence when you are harmed is dead. Any system that requires punishment to keep people in line, or fear of being isolated or rejected, if they need that to sustain themselves, that religion is dead. And it's dead because the God you worship does not exist. The God who would sit up there and bless you for turning a blind eye to the harm of children, to the harm of innocent people, no matter where they come from, to your own citizens and neighbors because they speak truth and they expose and speak about harm and damage plainly. If you need them to be silenced and you reconcile it to, oh, you should have complied, then you are worshiping a God that does not exist. Or at the very least, not the God that I worship, because my God doesn't do that. And I have proven, especially over the past year, that my God is real and stronger than yours. And any organization or institution that requires silence, punishment, or fear to sustain itself is not worthy of my belief, my labor, my support, or the protection that I can provide. It does not deserve the protection that I can influence. And so, I've done a lot of talking, so let me clarify. As I am practicing post-evangelicalism right now, as I'm transitioning out, it's these points. Ethics over institutional authority. My conscience is not outsourced to the patriarchy or to white supremacy, which are the cores of punishment culture. Harm reduction over reputation management. Belief systems have to reduce harm. It cannot explain it away. It cannot ignore it. Right. The rejection of punishment as a moral foundation. Fear, cruelty, and humiliation are not sacred tools. Truth-telling over enforced silence. Naming harm is required even when it disrupts comfort. Ignorance, willful or otherwise, is not a virtue. Because willful ignorance is just another way to shuck personal responsibility. That joy is a signal of alignment and not compliance. Your nervous system is a legitimate moral compass. Accountability without spectacle and responsibility that does not require humiliation or domination. Now let's talk about how I feel this aligns with me, because I didn't arrive to this suddenly or all of a sudden. I've lived these values before I had language to actually express them. My work, my relationships, the systems I build, the communities I design have always been centered around empathy, consent, and accountability. Right? I stress repair over control, domination, or punishment. I want to understand if you don't agree with me. I'm drawn to frameworks that teach through care rather than fear, and that measure integrity by outcomes rather than attention. Because saying, well, I didn't intend for it to happen that way may be true, but if you leave it at that and not face the actual outcome, that's shirking your responsibility. In my creative work, I build worlds that do not require players to be cruel in order to succeed. That's the reason why I don't do a D20 system right now. I design worlds where you cannot simply do anything you want. There are consequences and the world pushes back. I design systems in my professional life where failure is data, not condemnation, and where survival depends on paying attention, being kind, and responsible rather than sheer force. And these are not aesthetic choices. This isn't to look cool on the ground. This isn't to sound good on a podcast. I do it because life is a Souls-like roguelike, right? These are ethical choices, and these are ethical values, and they reflect how I believe people should be treated, especially when they're afraid, wounded, or uncertain, right? And for years, I've lived these values inside the PCA, assuming that shared language meant shared commitments, right? I thought, well, they are Christian and we speak the same language, so they would have the same values. But over time, it became clear that my faith was expressed through how I lived, while the institution required belief to be expressed through silence, compliance, and the management of harm, rather than its prevention. PE didn't change who I am. It clarified that I already had been living what I believed, and that continuing to do so required leaving. So, to review how PE aligns with my life and work is because I prioritize empathy, consent, and repair. I design systems where consequences exist without punishment. I treat failure as data, not as a moral condemnation. I believe survival depends on attention, responsibility, and care, not force. I value lived ethics and lived experience over shared language and adopted belief. I refuse silence when harm is present. I accept consequences without submitting to humiliation. And I build worlds and live in ways that are unpunishable by design. So, this is a point where folks are like, well, what about the Catholic Church or what about the Baptist Church? As if naming harm in one place requires cataloging it everywhere. The thing is that I'm not a part of those worlds. I didn't spend 14 years of lived experience in the Catholic Church or the Baptist Church because that wasn't my ministry. My ministry was the PCA. And for 14 years, witnessing a system that requires cruelty and silence to function. 14 years inside a structure invested in punishment, where silence is framed as wisdom, but its purpose is primarily to preserve status and power. 14 years watching harm being ignored when possible through willful ignorance, which is once again not a virtue, and managed when it can no longer be denied, but never meaningfully prevented. I spent 14 years in an environment where reputation was consistently prioritized over safety, and where exclusion and isolation waited for anyone who refused to remain silent. And that's why I had to draw the line. That I could not be part of an organization where child rape apologia and punishment culture was not a byproduct or something that just developed, but part and parcel of how everyday life works. And I don't need to prove this, because every last one of you knows what happens when harm is named. When I was in graduate school, a professor told us that at this level of education, students aren't learning entirely new information so much as learning the names for the things they already understood and knew innately. And it turns out that it's true for me here as well. Like I said earlier, it gave me a language that my body already knew. And that is, staying in the PCA would cost me my integrity, my peace, and eventually my joy. Not because I was wrong, because it wasn't, but because the system could not survive accountability. Where harm is so widespread that addressing it could destabilize power, preservation of the system becomes the highest value. It becomes the highest priority. Wealth, status, and the appearance of being untouchable matters more than truth and safety. Staying would have required betraying my conscience, my Christian conscience, and behaving as if the truth did not exist. It would have required silence, pretending not to know how the sausage was made, as it were, and participating in the management of harm when I saw how people were hurting and how people were causing damage and hurting others. And it required complicity. And I was, because I saw and I was silent. And after 14 years, I'd already watched one generation endure that bargain. And I'm not willing to stand by while another is asked to risk their safety so their parents can maintain proximity to power. So, after my last church visit, it was clear that the PCA as an organization would never be safe for me. It would never be a place where, even though I am whole and strive to remain that way, it's not a place I could have peace. I would always be spending my time protecting and shielding those who use grace as a weapon to punish. And what I mean is, the grace that I provided them, it gives them breathing room to punish others. And I've talked before about being assigned to protect and guide people who didn't deserve my power, and about how I long to use my resources to protect those who are being punished. And I have guided so many people towards lives that were right fitted for them. But I wanted to do more. I wanted to focus on that. So after 14 years and a lot of asking and a lot of lessons, I asked to be right fitted myself. And instead of being placed in yet another PCA church, I found post-evangelicalism. And even at my most vulnerable, because emotionally and spiritually, I'm exhausted. I went where the Lord sent me, because if he tells you to go, you go. And he told me to go to this small, fully formed, self-contained Episcopal church called Jubilee. Now, I had followed their vicar, the Reverend Lizzie McManus Down, on TikTok for years. She was Father Lizzie. And I joined the newsletter too, but I didn't go because I wasn't ready. But I was pleased to see that it was high church, which I adore, followed the liturgical calendar, and celebrated weekly communion. But once again, because I wasn't guided there, I didn't go. I just sat over them and prayed. Until a few weeks ago, I received an email about this special event featuring Father Lizzie, Brian Recker, the author of Hellbent, and Zach Lambert, the senior pastor of Restored Church, which was recommended to me some time ago by W.T. Meadows, one of my co-authors and friends. And I kept the event on my radar, but I didn't. It took me like a few days to decide to go. I mean, even though the Lord was like, yeah, we're doing this, I'm just like dragging my feet, registering, but I finally did. And since Brian was also preaching that morning, decided to join them for worship. From the moment I walked in, I could feel that I didn't need to keep my head on a swivel. That creeping stress that usually accompanies church visits simply wasn't there. I sat down and for the first time in years and years and years, well, actually, since I've been in Austin, truly, I sat down and experienced the service in full rest. It horrified me. It scared me so much that I almost didn't go back for the evening event. It felt so good and too good to be true. I hadn't felt such deep joy like that in so long. So I attended the event, went home, and cried tears of joy and praise. And I also didn't return for weeks later. Actually, I didn't return until yesterday, which is Ash Wednesday, which, once again, marks 40 days of abyss, quite literally. Also, a lot of people may not know this, but the church where I receive ashes becomes my home base for the year. And the concentration of my support, concentration of my prayers, the concentration of what I listen to and what I'm geared to is focused on that church for that year. And I knew immediately that this is where the Lord wanted me to operate from. Not necessarily Jubilee, because, not yet at least, because I'm still rather fragile, but from this post-evangelical lens, which faces in the same direction I do. Another thing is that I usually receive my commission, my overarching commission for the year on Ash Wednesday at the church where I receive ashes. And the Lord drove me to a sticker, and it said 3 words: Shield to Joyous. And after a lifetime of being courageous enough to live life with joy, it made all the sense in the world. Thanks be to God.